In the south of China, there lived a handsome and adventurous prince. At this particular time in his life, the prince was bored and lonely. He decided that he needed to spice up what was otherwise becoming a rather dull life, so he set out on a journey with an adventure in mind, and here's what happened to him. He took with him his favorite snow-white stallion, his finely adorned robe, and a large purse full of gold and jewels. He made his way up north to the palace of the rich and powerful emperor king named Ti. Upon reaching the edge of the surrounding town, he was greeted by the townsfolk, who immediately beseeched him for money for food. He asked them what the problem was, since he could see that the land was producing food in abundance and the houses were well kept. A man stepped up to him and said, "Our lands, our crops, our very homes have been lost to the emperor in a game of chance that he forces us to play. If we do not play, he taxes us so heavily that we cannot afford to live. If we play and lose, we lose all. If we win, we get to keep our lands, our homes, and more, but very few ever beat the emperor at his own game." "What is the nature of this game that the emperor is so good at?" the prince queried. The townsman said, "It is an evil game, a game played with cubes of ivory inset with the eyes of the snake." The prince thought about this for a while. He knew this game well, for he had played it often and was good at it himself. It sounded as if the emperor had an angle somehow, but there was only one way to find out. The prince turned to the crowd and said, "I do not have enough money to give to all of you, but if you wish it, I will be your champion and win enough for your whole town." The townspeople looked at him strangely, turned their backs, and walked away shaking their heads. The puzzled prince rode on to the palace. Soon he arrived at the massive doors. He announced himself to the guard. "I am a prince, and I am looking for a sporting game of chance." At this the huge doors slowly opened. There in the center of the courtyard sat a marvelous golden throne, piled high on one side with food dishes of every imaginable sort, on the other a mound of gold and jewels. Sitting on the throne was the Emperor King himself. He was the ugliest, the fattest, most grotesque man the prince had ever seen. The prince stepped up to him, kneeled, and said, "Great Emperor, I am but a humble prince from the lands to the south. I have heard of your skills with the ivory cubes, and wish to compete with you for the glory and honor of such an experience." With a greedy smile, the emperor replied, "Glory and honor is fine in their respective places, but temporal, material men must play for temporal, material things. Otherwise, what is there to encourage us to excel? What do you have to waste or a wager?" The prince brought out his purse of gold and jewels. The emperor laughed and whispered aside to his entourage, "This will be no contest of sweat and endurance, but this prince will soon depart a few pounds lighter, I'll wager you that." Then he said in a louder voice, "Let the game begin." After some time had passed, and the game run its course, the emperor looked up at the prince, smiled, a voracious smile, and said, "You played very well, prince. As the old proverb goes, a fool and his money are soon parted. Would you like to try again?" The prince thought for a second. "Do you wish to play for this beautiful robe I am wearing?" The emperor sighed, "I have so many of those, but I will play you for it anyway, just for the sport of it." And so they played another game with the cubes, and the prince lost his robe. The king asked the prince what else he might have to wager with, and the prince said, "I have my beautiful white stallion outside. I have traveled far, and I am very weary and in need of a night's rest. I will return tomorrow if I may, bide your leave for now." The emperor looked disappointed, but agreed to play him the very next day. The prince left the palace in search of shelter for the night. Having lost his money, he would have to make do. Soon he found a stable that looked dry. Without his robe to keep him warm, he had to cover himself with hay. The prince spoke to his stallion, "I certainly made a mess of things today, and after tomorrow I may lose you too. I wish I knew how the emperor wins so often." After a while, the handsome prince fell into a troubled sleep. he began to dream a strange dream. In this dream, there appeared an old man with a beard, a walking stick, and a maroon robe. Without speaking, the old man's eyes peered into the prince's eyes, and what felt like love and trust flowed between them. Then the old man smiled, waved his staff, and a scene appeared like magic. It was the emperor's palace seen from a viewpoint in the sky. Walls circled it, and in one corner the prince could make out what looked to be an ivory pagoda. It was small, with only one way in, and the door was locked. Instantly, the prince was inside the pagoda. A lantern illuminated one corner of the straw-covered floor, and beside it on a table was a golden cage. In the cage sat a small black rabbit, and to his surprise it spoke to him. "Nothing is what it appears to be. A cage of gold is not what imprisons me. My soul cries out to be free. Your true love is the only key." The scene faded to sunlight, streaming in through the cracks of the stable walls as the prince awoke. The prince felt alive that morning than he had ever felt before, full of energy and confidence. He was ready for the emperor. There was no doubt in his mind now that he could be beating the emperor at his own game. Mounting his white stallion, the prince rode toward the palace. When the gate watchman saw him, the door swept open. The prince rode over to the emperor's throne in the center of the courtyard, dismounted, and without kneeling, he said, "Prepare to lose your most precious treasure, the one thing that brought you fortune in the past." The emperor was astounded and suddenly felt unsure. The prince spoke again. "I will wager my steed against what is in your ivory pagoda. If you refuse, I will let the world know that you, the greatest gambler in all of China, refused a wager." The emperor knew that he was stuck and threw the ivory cubes down in anger. What turned up was the evil eyes of the snake. Then it was the prince's turn, and he rolled a 7. He had won the game on one toss. "I will trouble you for the keys to the ivory pagoda now," he said. The emperor hurled the keys at him in a rage. The prince hopped up on his horse and rode straight for the pagoda. Inside, it took a while to grow accustomed to the darkness, but soon he could just make out an object in the corner by the lamp on the table. It was the golden cage that he saw in his dream. Inside the cage was the black rabbit with deep dark eyes, just as in his dream. But this rabbit uttered not a word, nor made a sound. The prince shook his head, scooped up the golden cage, mounted his stallion, and rode like the wind toward the slowly closing palace gates. The heavy door closed right behind him, but his pace never slackened until he was away from the surrounding town and into rolling countryside again. At last, he made his horse drop into a slower gait and peeked under the cover of the golden cage. Inside, the black rabbit was curled into a ball with its eyes closed, apparently asleep. The prince rode on into the hills, which became steeper with every mile. Soon the hills turned into sharp crags, ravines, and cliffs that jutted out over beautiful green valleys. The prince stopped at a high place, sheltered from the wind. He tied his horse to a tree and placed the cage under an overhanging rock. He gathered wood for a fire, started it ablaze, and sat with his back to the rock. Reflecting upon the day, he said to himself, "I certainly found the adventure that I was looking for, but the pieces do not yet fit together. I have had the honor and glory of beating the emperor at his own game. I might use the gold in this cage to recoup my gambling losses, and I have this rabbit, which may be good for a small meal. But..." With this thought the prince fell fast asleep. He awoke into a wonderful place, an amazing place, a place he had never seen before, but was familiar all the same. The floor was polished, translucent, with rose-colored marble, with gold pillars all around that held draped curtains of white silk, like fluffy white clouds. Something caught the prince's eye from the far side of the room. Across the marble floor glided the most graceful woman he had ever seen in his life. She was petite, every feature of her body and face perfect, and her long hair was jet black. Her eyes were like deep pools without limits to their depth, and her lips promised kisses forever. Silently they touched hands, fingertips to fingertips. They began to dance around the room, moving together in perfect harmony, their eyes locked in an embrace of love, souls in unison. Then she whispered in his ear. Love in harmony with a conscious mind. Greater than a love selfish and blind. True love that is gentle and kind. Outlasts the test of space and time. With that she kissed him softly, and the dream faded away. The prince awoke to the sound of horses' hooves upon the rock ledge. Before he could act, a large sack was thrown over his head. He was beaten with bamboo sticks and thrown over the side of a cliff. He hit something hard and blacked out. When he came to, sunlight peeped through a tiny hole in the sack. In the right position, he could see that he was on a small ledge some distance below the top of the cliff. He had been lucky this time. The prince managed to free himself from the sack and stand on two shaky legs. The top of the cliff was just too far to reach. Just then, he heard a strange noise from above, and a staff was lowered to him by an invisible hand. The prince climbed to the top, and to his surprise, there stood a kindly old man with white hair and a beard. He spoke. We do not have much time. We must catch the emperor's men before they reach the palace with the princess. The prince said, What princess? Who are you? How do you know me? And where is my horse? The prince exclaimed, Would you please be kind enough to explain to me what is going on? The old gentleman replied, If you would sit down, I will attempt to explain to you the whole story. The old man continued. Many years ago, there lived in these parts a wizard who was very evil and practiced black magic. He sold his services to anyone who was willing to pay the price. One day a handsome prince sought out his abilities. His request was to become rich and powerful. Knowing that all black magic demands a sacrifice, the evil wizard decided, You must give up your future bride, you are betrothed to, the Princess Ling, from the southern provinces. If you choose, she can be your tender for riches and power. The prince did not really know this young girl, for the marriage had been arranged by his family and hers. He thought for a moment and agreed. It was no great loss to him. Any need for love seemed to vanish next to his need for power and wealth. Very soon after the wizard cast his spell, the prince found he had everything that he could possibly want, except for two things: true love, which he'd traded away, and good looks, which began to fade with every passing day. The evil wizard, true to his profession, turned the Princess Ling into a rabbit, making her an unwilling good luck charm to the prince, who by this time had become the emperor. The wizard sealed her into the magic cage without a door and had the emperor build an ivory pagoda to keep her in. The old man paused in his story, then concluded. There is only one way to free her, and that way I am not allowed to tell you, for you must realize that which you already know. The prince remained silent for a long time. Can you show me where the princess is now? He said. The old man waved his staff once again. In the prince's mind there appeared a very dark place, deep in the heart of the palace. In this room on a table was a golden cage. In it was the black rabbit. I will rescue the princess and free her from the golden cage, said the prince. It is going to take more than your will and physical strength to free her from the spell, young prince, said the old man. I will do my best, said the prince. I can help you only one more time. Prepare yourself. With that, the old man waved his staff and the prince suddenly found himself in a dark corridor. After a few moments his eyes grew accustomed to the dark. He listened closely, heard no sound, and gingerly made his way down the corridor. Soon he felt an opening in the wall, at the doorway. He listened carefully. The prince went into the room and saw the table in the middle of the floor. On it was the cage, and in the cage was something dark and furry. He ran over to the cage, and in the cage was something, but before he reached it, the big iron door slammed shut behind him. Metal scraped metal as the bolt slid home. He had been tricked. Inside the cage, before him was a dead rat. The prince was in despair. He could almost hear the emperor laughing at his plight. After many hours, the prince fell asleep. He began to dream. In this dream, the beautiful princess came to him dressed in white and whispered in his ear, "You must escape late tonight. With an open heart I await. Find your way toward the light. What appears as rock is only slate." The prince awoke quietly. He felt much better. Rising to his feet, he circled the room, slowly tapping the walls. In one corner, near the floor, the wall sounded hollow. He kicked with his foot several times, finally breaking through to the other side. He enlarged the hole until he could squeeze his body through completely. There he faced a choice. One tunnel went downwards, another went upwards. He could detect the faintest glimmer of light. He chose that one and began to climb on his hands and knees. To his surprise, he emerged into the emperor's room. There beside the empty throne on a solid gold table was the golden cage that held the real Princess Rabbit. She was sitting up, nose twitching nervously. The prince scooped up the cage and dashed toward the doorway, through the curtains and out into the hall. He quickly located the courtyard and stables. Inside the stables, his favorite white stallion was waiting for him. Grasping the cage, the prince jumped up on his horse and rode out into the courtyard, only to discover that the massive gates were closed. How am I going to escape now? He wondered desperately. Then he was startled into action by the striking of a gong, the sound of which was resounding through the palace. The huge gates started to open on their own. As the prince sped through the narrow opening, the gates began to close again. There on the other side stood the kindly old man with a big smile on his face. He gestured for the prince to move quickly. "You must hurry, there is danger still. Remember, true love works miracles." And with that he vanished into thin air. Just at that moment the prince heard the whiz of arrows leaving bowstrings, and fear penetrated his heart. He spurred his horse into a full gallop, arrows hitting the ground all around him. A couple of arrows struck his saddle as he sped toward the mountains. In the relative safety of the crags and cliffs again, he dismounted. The prince reached for the cage on the back of his saddle. What he saw made his heart freeze. Sticking through the bars of the cage was a single arrow. Blood was dripping from its bottom. Trembling, the prince lifted the silk cover. The arrow had struck the Princess Rabbit's shoulder. She was alive, but barely. Carefully the prince clipped the feathered end of the arrow off and slowly pushed the shaft through the other side of the shoulder. Quickly he bound up the wound with the silk cover to stop the bleeding. He started crying and his tears fell on her fur coat. "Don't die, little princess," the prince whispered in sorrow. "I love you and only want what you want. I hope it is your desire to spend your life with me as my true love. If not, then I would wish to die in your place." He closed his eyes and tried to concentrate on the wise old man. He recalled the feeling of a great love that flowed between them, and the trust he had felt. Suddenly, in his mind's eye, there stood his friend, smiling. He winked once and then was gone. A loud click rang in the prince's ears and the atmosphere changed. The prince opened up his eyes, and to his delight, there stood the woman of his dreams. She stepped toward him. A trace of blood still stained her white tunic, but she gazed at him with a smile. "You have broken the spell, you have discovered the meaning of true love. As long as you live in this pure state, seeing me as the woman that I am and not just a good luck charm, I will be your true love." They kissed each other deeply, then climbed up on the white stallion and rode toward the south of China. Soon afterwards, the townspeople discovered that the gates to the emperor's palace had been left wide open. Upon entering, they were amazed to find the courtyard empty. Piles of gold, jewels, and rotten food were strewn around the empty throne. The emperor had vanished. The townspeople helped themselves to the gold, silver, and jewels, as it had all been theirs once. Yet they left the throne behind as a reminder that people may acquire riches through the use of power and greed, but they have attained nothing but empty illusions without the blessings of true love. The end.